You probably want, or at least expect, me to talk about the mass shooting in New Zealand that's happened as I'm making this video. But I want to follow my own advice and wait for the dust to settle before I comment on that. And I frankly just don't have the stomach for it today, so maybe another day. And me blocking people with aposematic profiles seems to already be paying off, because apparently there was a big clusterfuck on Twitter yesterday about something that I said, and I barely saw any of it. And it's centered around a new RPG, crowdfunded RPG, called Swordsfall. Okay, already annoying, because everyone knows it's rocks fall, everyone dies, not swords fall, everyone dies. What I objected to was a rather grifting tweet that one of the developers of this game put out, centered around their race and their sexual preference and gender identity, in an attempt to get Polygon to do something covering what they're doing. Some of that objection stems from personal disappointment, and some of it comes from being consistent in my application of my principles. My disappointment comes from the fact that Afrofuturism, which this game is based in and derived from, it's interesting aesthetically and in terms of exploring new mythologies that haven't been explored before, when it doesn't devolve into we was kangs and the racism that of the type that the Nation of Islam and so on put out, the idea that white people are necessarily inherently evil in some way, and so on. It's when it gets to that point, it's kind of disgusting, and in some ways Black Panther was verging on that. This game is clearly cashing in on that interest in Afrofuturism and so on, that zeitgeist that's there. And up until this point, there hadn't been so much of that trying to cash in on white guilt and so forth. And so I was thoroughly disappointed to see this, partly because of that, and it suggests a certain direction in which the game might fall. And also, you know, it's Polygon. They're appealing to total shitheads. So yeah, some of it stems from personal disappointment in all of this, but the other aspect is that in reducing yourself to your race and your gender identity and using that to try and garner support, rather than selling people on how good the game is, how good the system is, yeah, that side of things, you're engaging in and perpetuating racism. When people support you for that reason, it's patronizing. It's the soft bigotry of low expectations, that phrase that people like to throw out there. It's reducing yourself to that racial status. It's provoking racial animus and so on to try and cash in and progress on that basis, on those frankly uninteresting innate characteristics that you have, rather than the merits of this thing that you have produced and put forth. So if I'm going to take issue with the racial animus and focus that exists within, say, my Farog, then in order to be consistent, I have to do the same when it comes to games like this, when you try to grift off the back of these immutable characteristics that are essentially meaningless in order to try and sell your game. You know, I have to be consistent. I have to call out racism wherever I see it. So I look at this, and I look at this attempt to grift, which may have come off the back of advice from the Zweihander guy, who certainly never met a sales tactic he doesn't like. Well, I look at that, and then I look at the other examples in the industry. I look at Mike Pondsmith, who created Cyberpunk, and no one knew or cared what colour or anything he was going into it. And we're about to have Cyberpunk 2077. He never tried to cash in on his status, as far as I've been able to see. Look at Louis Porter Jr., who's another games publisher who happens to be of colour. Nobody cares, nobody gives a shit. He doesn't try to sell himself on that basis, and he's a pretty shameless self-promoter as well. So you look at these instances and we don't see this same grifting. They just concentrate on putting out good, cool looking product and let that speak for them. You know, that's where the worth is, not these uninteresting, innate, immutable characteristics that they have that are the least interesting, least important thing about them compared to their talent and their drive and their energy in producing games material. This is just unnecessary. Frankly, you've got bigger problems in creating a game like this. There have been numerous attempts to bring African mythology into gaming before. They either haven't worked out or they've been reacted to with hostility, not because people object to Africa or whatever else, or Africans, or African Americans, or whatever. It's nothing to do with that. It's just that the audience isn't there. And there's a paradox here, the paradox of representation. You want to say representation matters. The studies we have, fortunately, say that it doesn't particularly. Not that we have many studies and they're computer game focused. But then you want to aim at one of the tiniest demographics in gaming, and that isn't due to racism. I mean, I'm going to have to assume that you're American and you're concentrating on an American audience, and African Americans only make up a minority percentage of the American population. And gaming tends to appeal more to men for whatever reason. Again, I don't think sexism, just the nature of the beast. And there is a problem in African American communities, and to a lesser extent here in the UK, of there being a kind of anti-intellectual bias, bullying that goes on towards kids, mostly male kids, who show any real talent for anything academic. So you've got all these uphill struggles to climb in order to make this product a success. So it's kind of understandable, I guess, why you would zero in on white guilt, liberal white guilt in the US, to get yourself funded and to try and draw up interest. But it's still distasteful, and like I say, you've already got bigger issues. If you want to do more to get minorities into gaming, I don't know that representation is necessarily the most effective tactic. The most effective tactic would be to try and attack this culture of anti-intellectualism and encourage academic pursuits and so on. As a natural outfall of that, as well as helping these communities do better, as well as helping people do better, they would then be more likely to be interested in this kind of pastime and hobby. And the same thing happens in white working class communities here in the UK as well. And I think the solution is not necessarily to create games targeting the white working class community because they're simply uninterested, but rather trying to shift that culture of anti-intellectualism somewhat. And what I meant by the paradox of representation is, if representation really genuinely matters, and then you're targeting yourself at a tiny demographic and fixating your representation upon that tiny demographic, then by your own logic you're excluding everybody else, and thereby hamstringing any attempt you might be making to get your game out there to the largest number of people. At the end of the day, I hope it's a successful and a good game after all of this. My objection is purely the attempt to market it in such a reductive, regressive, racist way. That's what I object to. But, you know, I hope it succeeds. There's been many previous attempts to do similar things that haven't succeeded. I think for the demography reasons that I've pointed out. But in this febrile, sock-just atmosphere, maybe there's enough guilt and enough virtue signalling around to allow it to succeed. I'd just rather it would succeed by being a good game. Zang.
China and the working Yorkshire miner, but I've never met a nice South African.
Now he's never met an Aussie African, and it's not bloody surprising, mate, 'cause we're a bunch of arrogant grosters who hate black people